Hello and welcome to this episode of the Star Wars Universe Podcast.
And the Animation Deliberation Podcast.
And Paul, just throw it in yours as well.
And the Zen Madman Twitch cast. I don't know. I don't have a podcast at the moment.
We are building a Rebel Alliance here. An alliance of voices coming together to talk about this episode of the Star Wars TV show, The Bad Batch, Episode 11. We're coming to you live on Twitch along with Paul Hoppy and J Scotty St. Clair. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. My name is Matthew. I'm your host. I'm joined today, as I said, by Paul Hoppy and J Scotty St. Clair. First off, Paul, coming fresh off of his Twitch stream, jumping on with us. You've watched a little bit of media the last 10 hours or so. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm surprised that I don't feel worse because I did not get much sleep.
Yes. Paul and I both decided not to watch the movie in theaters, so we both watched Black Widow on Disney Plus right when it came out, which was midnight for Paul, 2 a.m. for me. I went right to bed after and then watched The Bad Batch this morning. Paul, you watched both, so
that's correct.
We're going to try and keep those two very distinct for any spoiler purposes, but I apologize in advance if we cross the streams a bit. In seriousness, no, we're not going to spoil anything.
Yeah, no spoilers.
What about you, J. Scotty? Did you watch Bad Batch at a stupid o'clock time in the morning?
Well, anybody that's been listening to me for any given amount of time, everyone knows that I have what we like to call grandpa hours, and I'm usually up and at them pretty early, so... I did squeeze my first viewing in about 7:30 my time, and I actually got 2 viewings in, so definitely ready to discuss this one. Yeah.
And this was an episode that was very heavy on stuff from the prior TV shows. And as we've talked about before, Paul and I have seen Clone Wars and Rebels. I know, J. Scotty, you have not. So I'm definitely really interested to hear how the episode was for both of us.
Oh, yeah.
But just to start, J. Scotty, can you give us kind of a quick plot summary? What happens this episode?
Yeah, so this one, we spend the entirety of the episode on the planet Ryloth, which is the Twi'lek homeworld. And this very much puts us back in that story arc about seeing the Republic transitioning to the Empire and what that looks like on these various worlds. And most of it's told from the perspective of this character, Hera, who I was not familiar with. I know, I've heard the name. I know that there was a Twi'lek character, a pilot of sorts, from Rebels, and obviously this is her story of, her uncle having this rebellion going on in the midst of this occupation, and they take all the weapons away, so there's an arrangement made to smuggle in some more weapons, and that's the one scene that we get with our title characters, the Bad Batch. And from there, we Crosshair was kind of present through the proceedings, and he takes down the ship. We get the assassination of Senator Ta and the framing of Hera's parents, and they get arrested, and Hera's just kind of out on her own from there, and I think that pretty much sums up what took place in the episode. I might be missing some details here and there, but I think I covered most of it.
No, I think you hit it pretty hard.
I think one detail that I'd throw in is possibly attempted assassination.
Yes, I made note of that as well.
Like, it's unclear whether or not it was attempted and then actually completed by someone else, or whether it was specifically not actually a complete assassination, but more just like shot, so.
Right, to look like he's been killed or something.
Like
exactly.
Possibly a lobotomy. Yeah, we know about Crosshair's accuracy, so.
Right.
I was trying to remember, Paul, does that senator appear in Star Wars Rebels? I don't think he does.
I'm not sure. I did a little bit of online digging, mostly because of some really obscure aspect that I wanted to look up. But that senator, I think, does appear in some Sith something, like that takes place after this. So there's speculation about whether or not they are alive because they show up in some other piece of media, which may or may not be canon.
Right, but, that's fair. So I have to say, overall, I think this is my favorite episode we've gotten since like the first 3 or 4.
Wow.
And we can talk about this more. I don't think it's coincidental that it's the episode where our titular characters appear the least. Part of it, I think, is, and this is why, J. Scotty, especially, I'm curious your take on it, is just the kind of, not even just the nostalgia factor, but seeing characters who I know and love so much from Star Wars Rebels, and a little bit from Clone Wars, and getting to kind of see their origin story and see development of the characters that made so much sense. But I also just feel like we were getting a lot more of the kind of world building that we would wanting, and with characters who have. I feel like on some, and maybe we're just kind of jump right into this from the beginning, but I'll hear your kind of general thoughts. For me, it felt like with the Bad Batch characters, I get the sense that they don't really have an arc for them that's going to last 16 episodes, and so we're kind of having them in a holding pattern a little bit the last few episodes, and so getting to spend some time with some other characters in another story, and a story that feels very relevant because it's, the Empire. We got to see the Empire when people loved it. Now we're getting to see the Empire when people are not thrilled about it. So I just really loved this episode. What'd you both think?
After you, Paul.
Oh, I was gonna let you be positive and then say like, eh.
That's funny.
I watched the episode and thought, I bet Matthew's gonna really love this episode. And then I also thought like it's, which it's just like. I think it's great to tell that story. It's just actually, it's not as interesting to me. I really enjoy the choice of having the title characters be connected to the story, but not the protagonist of the story, right? They're sort of, it's like a cameo basically on their own show, which I think is cool. I think that's interesting. There were some things that took me out of it a little bit. Like I started off watching it in English, and I found the accents a little kind of off-putting. Like nothing against anybody having an accent. I mean, everybody has an accent, right? And I want there to be representation of people with all sorts of different accents in all sorts of different media. But in the Star Wars universe, it's often been kind of problematic. Like going back to like the Phantom Menace particularly,
right?
Sure. And also I'd watched most of the episodes in Spanish, where if those characters have different accents, my Spanish isn't strong enough to really understand.
Your ear's not picking them up,
right? Like to what they maybe are supposed to represent or whatever. So I actually just switched it back to Spanish, and I was like, okay, I enjoy this more. But like,
that's fair.
It was interesting. I mean, does Hera have how does Hera speak in Rebels?
So yeah, I realize if you didn't see Rebels in English, you may not have picked up on this. They present Hera in Rebels as being very good at code switching. That she has that kind of French, kind of accent, which in Clone Wars they established that accent is not everyone on Twi'lek, but is certainly by a lot of people on Twi'lek. Okay. I'm sorry, on Ryloth, the planet of the Twi'lek.
Of the Twi'lek.
But that, to some extent, Hera has, she has lost her accent.
Okay.
But that it's somewhat intentional, and that, I haven't seen it for a couple of years, so I'm not exactly sure, but I remember there's a scene where, there are scenes in Rebels where she goes back to Ryloth and interacts with Twi'leks who have that accent, and her accent comes back somewhat. And there's some discussion of, it's, obviously, I'm not someone who... Code switching has not been a big part of my life. There's a little bit of it when I was kind of in two different worlds in high school, but by no means the same thing. And I remember folks who do live a very kind of code switching kind of a life, which by the way, for those who don't know the term, it's the kind of idea of you have one manner of talking or dressing or being in your home or your family, and then feeling like when you go to work or you go to school, you kind of have to change it. Miles Morales in Into the Spider-Verse, I think, is a great example of this. Where he feels like he has to talk a different way when he's around his fellow students or something like that. And so people I know who have had that experience said that they really identified with the way Hera did that. So
that's cool.
Yeah, so I kind of feel like knowing that helps give the accents a lot more context. But yeah, I think if you didn't, I can see not. And so J Scotty, especially because you don't have all that context, what was your take on the accent specifically, but then want to hear your thoughts on it in general?
No, I'm really glad that Paul brought that up because I was curious. I wanted to ask him what language he watched the episode in because it was one of those things. I don't speak French or have any kind of accent like that, so I'm not coming from a perspective of being offended or anything like that. I'm not saying that you are, but I thought it did a good job of kind of invoking that feeling of occupied France during World War II with the Empire very much are the Nazis. Obviously, they have British accents for the most part, but I did appreciate that aspect. The seizing of the weaponry and this guerrilla fighting force, and I just thought it did a nice job of adding a little bit of flair and personality to the Star Wars universe. Obviously, the Twi'lek are a species that we've seen since the original trilogy, and it's I haven't seen Rebels, so I didn't have that connection to Hera. I didn't know what to expect from her voice, and I enjoyed it. Yeah.
And I think that the French Resistance thing is actually very fitting because, again, here I'm trying to make sure I remember this properly. So listeners, either on Twitch or after this, please feel free to write in and correct me. But my memory is that in the Clone Wars show, Ryloth is basically like, ruled by he at first is fighting against the Republic before he's fighting against the Confederates, before he's fighting against the Confederacy, and that there is that same element of like the main Ryloth government is kind of like Vichy France, and it's kind of like it's going along with these people, and he's kind of leading a resistance movement. So it's funny, I hadn't even thought of it in those terms, but as you said it, I think a lot of times the accents, especially in Clone Wars, feel either like they're putting into racist stereotypes, or they're just like, let's have these people have South African accents. Who cares?
Right.
And it just feels weird. But there, I think actually the more I think about it, it actually is kind of perfect for what they were going for with that.
I like it more now. I mean, I can see that. Like, it was... When I said off-putting, I meant, like, off-putting. Not, like, deeply offended. Not, like...
You said the right things.
Yeah, sort of like... Thank you. Sort of, like, confused. Sort of like, what's... What are they going for here? But seeing kind of more of the context, I'm like, okay, I can see that.
Yeah, makes sense. So, J Scotty, what do you think of the episode overall? Like, were you kind of lost with all these new characters, or do you kind of feel like you could really get pulled into it?
So I think that's one of the things about the show. Even when we're spending time with these characters that I'm not super familiar with, there's always a pretty strong story, and the writing. We talk about this being an episodic show and getting these standalone stories in each episode. In that regard, I thought it was a pretty tight story. I was never too lost. Again, it was nice to get some context into this culture and this planet that I'd always kind of been referenced to. Outside of that, the animation continues to be really stellar. I really like some of the action sequences. The sound design stood out to me. Some of the music really stood out to me. It's just nice to see some of those classic vehicles like the speeder bikes, the land speeders, even the LATTs, the low atmosphere aerial transports from. Yeah, it's basically what the Mandalorian has, but his is a modified version of that. And speaking of the Mandalorian, we got the blurgs back from episode 1 of the Mandalorian. So I just love the connectivity there.
It's nice to see the blurgs and the ships that the Twi'leks used. It's clearly a very different kind of ship, but it has the same kind of like front up and down. Like the front of it looks a little similar to Slave One, the ship that is Boba Fett's ship. Which, by the way, for people who think Disney changed the name of the ship, they didn't. That's a made-up controversy by people that think things are too woke or whatever. If you look at the packaging, they always package it like something was sold as Luke Skywalker's starship. It wasn't changed from being an X-Wing. So put that controversy aside. But my own rant aside there, I definitely like the front of it looked a lot like that, because that kind of like, lands like this, and you have no idea what the hand gestures I'm making in the podcast, but it's vertical design instead of horizontal, is what I mean.
I'm actually really glad that you brought up those ships specifically, because I did make note. This episode very much reminded me of like being a kid, like with my brother, and having our action figures, and just like we had action figures of like Bib Fortuna and whatnot, and we didn't have the full backstory for them, so we made up our own stories, and we had the land speeder and the speeder bikes and stuff like that. But with the design of those ships specifically, I really felt like it was almost like a Lego set of like the USS Enterprise. Like I could see all the elements. Sorry to bring up Star Trek here. I'm not even the biggest Star Trek fan. But
no hate. I love both.
Yeah, one of them looks like the Enterprise to me.
Yeah, I felt like you had all the pieces of the Enterprise just rearranged.
Yeah. For sure. I was like, when did the Federation get here?
Yeah, I think it's certainly true. One thing I noted that I thought was interesting was we had one of the characters was a specific clone who I'm trying to look up his name now. I think it was something like
Hauser.
Not Havoc.
Hauser, he stood out to me as well.
Hauser, yeah. Mm-hmm. This was, unless I'm forgetting something, the first time that, other than Rex at the beginning, we had Rex for one episode, but this was the first time that, other than any of the Bad Batch folks, we had a specific clone who clearly was having his own thoughts. I'd kind of gotten the sense for a while that most of the clones we were dealing with were kind of Order 66 automatons to some extent.
Sure.
What did you kind of take of his character and the way he was? Because he certainly seemed like there were some moments where he was like not, at one point he was going to kind of let Hera off the hook because he had a good relationship with Cham. He's not just kind of like good soldiers follow orders. What was your take on him and what they're doing with the whole idea of the clones with his character?
I like that. I'm I've kind of had enough with mind control.
No idea what you're talking about there.
Yeah. Cut also was in the second episode, right?
Yeah.
Correct.
The defector or whatever. Deserter, whatever you want to call somebody who escaped slavery, and then people say things that don't make sense. Anyway, but this was the first clone I think we saw still with the Empire who seems to be like, I don't know about this.
Yeah.
And it feels like the seeds of the clone rebellion or something, right? Like where I don't know how that's going to end up, but it definitely felt like he did not want to go along with exactly what the Empire was doing, and I really appreciated that. That was one of my favorite parts of the episode. I also want to just comment on there were some sound cues that I thought were fantastic, and I'm glad you pointed that out, J Scotty. That were like calls back. Some were like callbacks to Rebels, and some felt like they were callbacks to like the original trilogy. Some of the themes. The music continues to be outstanding, but it definitely stood out to me in this episode. I really like having, showing some dissent amongst the clones, and it's like they might have a chip, but it's like they're not going to be automatons all the time. It's like sometimes the chip is like doing a thing, but I hope that they find some way of kind of going away from that a little bit,
Yeah.
Is there going to be a mission where they go and try and, if there are chips that are programming them to do a thing, but they're able to engage aspects of it, right, to kind of program them in live time, couldn't the Bad Batch go and, disrupt that, maybe?
Yeah.
I think that would be interesting. Obviously, we know that the Clone Army doesn't rebel and then overthrow the Empire. That takes a little while longer. Spoilers for Return of the Jedi and
yes.
the original trilogy. But So I really liked that character because he felt like a character to me, right?
Yeah.
Not just like a random trooper who was just good soldiers follow orders.
Right.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised that neither one of you are familiar. I felt like they were setting him up as a character that I. Maybe had I watched Rebels or Clone Wars that I might have some familiarity with, but I wonder what his future is going to be. He definitely stood out, everything from just like the turquoise color sash that we haven't seen before to his haircut. And just his personality, the fact that he was the one that talked Cham down, in addition to Syndulla as well. But I've got to wonder, the choice to have Rampart be the main Imperial leadership that was present for these proceedings, it makes me wonder what is going to be the conflict between Crosshair and Rampart, and potentially Hauser. I'm wondering now, because he was introduced in this episode. We know Rampart is kind of the one that is advocating for the move away from clones to conscripted soldiers. So I've got to wonder, is there a big conflict coming between Crosshair and Rampart and potentially Hauser here? What do you guys think about that?
I think that's likely, and I'll kind of echo what Paul has said. And for me, the topic of agency is a very important one that I think over the last couple of months keeps coming up. I don't like stories where people don't have agency and where it's, mind control makes them bad, and then someone does the thing or removes the chip or whatever it is, and all of a sudden they're good. I like when, to me, brainwashing is much more the you've conditioned a person to make choices and then they can choose something else, but they're fighting conditioning. That's to me, that's much of an interesting story. And so, because one of the things I think that was so interesting about the clones is that, very much unlike what I think people thought they were supposed to do, is that they developed relationships. And they developed relationships with the Jedi, they developed relationships with each other, and they developed relationships with the people they were protecting or working with. So especially, I think Hauser is not a character we've met before, and at first I kind of wished it was, but then actually I think it's a lot better that it's not, because it's more of a blank slate. Mm-hmm. I love the idea that, like, even if it is kind of a, like, he may still have good soldiers follow orders. His orders were to protect the Twi'leks. His orders were to defend Ryloth. His orders were to work with people like Cham. And so I would kind of love it if he, like, has a real kind of moral moment, not of, like, a chip one way or the other, but where he really decides, being a good soldier, being a good person is supporting these people who I've built relationships with. So yeah, I think that could definitely be very interesting. Paul, what's your kind of take on it?
Yeah, I would love that. I share your feelings on, like, conditioning, sort of brainwashing. Like, that's a real world thing, right?
Yeah.
That's, like, what people face all the time, just in terms of, like, literally just, like, society that we exist in, and also more overt, like, attempts to control people. And so when you tell stories that involve that as an element, there's a character's agency is challenged, but it isn't non-existent. Whereas when it's just total brute force mind control, either from a chip or some magical power or whatever, it's then that character is no longer doing those character things, and there's not really a connection to the real world in some ways, you know, in terms of, like, actions people take. So I would really like it if, this character does have, like, well, but I was, sort of like their conditioning was to defend Ryloth originally, right?
Right.
And then it's like, now it's sort of being changed, and if it's just being changed with a chip, then there's not a whole lot of question to have there. But if it's being changed by just, like, receiving new orders and being like, well, hey, but these orders kind of make all the other orders I was following before feel like they don't make sense.
Right.
So I think that would be an interesting story.
Yeah.
And I would like to see that. And I feel like that feels like something that they are setting up kind of deliberately, going in that direction.
And one way they could... This is one of those things where, like, they've dropped a few hints, and I hope they're going to pick up on this, but they may just be a little bit of non-consistent writing. Mm-hmm. Like, one thing they set up early is that there was this way of kind of, like, doubling down on the chip that people like Crosshair and others went through. And so I think you could do something interesting with, like, for those people, it is still kind of mind control, which is not great, but at least then you can understand that most of the clones, especially the ones who haven't cycled back through Coruscant, don't have that. And so for them it is sort of like Order 66 was like right then kill all the Jedi, but then it kind of fade and because I do want them to be consistent about, like, is it the chip or is it agency? But I think that would be a really nice way to say, like, you can have some agency for most of the clones, even if not for Crosshair himself. Though in the end, I want Crosshair to have agency too, but I just don't know where we can go with that.
I think they sort of established that the chips are non-perfect.
Right.
Like in the Clone Wars, a chip malfunctions and goes off early and, should have exposed the whole plot, but, like, the Jedi are idiots, I guess. But, like, and, like, some, like, in Clone Wars, there's other clones who kind of somewhat resisted, at least for a while, right? And it doesn't seem to have worked with most of the Bad Batch, but it did with Crosshair. And so they've kind of sort of, I think, deliberately written that it's like they kind of get to decide, right? And ultimately, like, I think the plot gets to decide, right? And that could be frustrating at times, but it does feel like at least they're being consistent in terms of it's going to be somewhat inconsistent, and we know that ahead of time. And so maybe Hauser's chip just isn't as... It just doesn't function as efficiently as, as Crosshair's or whatever.
Right. I will say one other part to me is funny. When J Scotty, when we started talking about Admiral Rampart playing such a big part, I thought you were going to go into something else. I love the point you brought up, to be clear, which is a lot of the frustration I'm having. Rampart feels like a perfectly fine generic Imperial officer who's not very interesting, but is just Imperial officer number 25, whatever. Which I would be fine with him having become the main protagonist if the first couple episodes and the marketing hadn't made me think Tarkin was going to be the main protagonist. Like,
No,
every time
Yeah.
Rampart is on
Antagonist, right?
screen,
That's where it does not mean what you think.
I don't know why Tarkin isn't. Like, we have a good voice actor who can play Tarkin. It's not Uncanny Valley stuff. Every time I see Rampart, I'm like, okay, but you could have Tarkin. Like, why isn't this Tarkin? And granted, Tarkin is a different role and more powerful, but kind of what's your thought on that? Are you enjoying Rampart there? Do you want more Tarkin?
I like Rampart for the role he plays. Like I said, I think the most interesting things there are what we saw from him initially, the fact that he's the one that's advocating for the conscripted soldiers so strongly. But I do agree with what you're saying there. It could be potentially a stronger character choice, and just endear us even more to the character of Tarkin. He's obviously has been such a even though we really only seen him in A New Hope, and then people can take or leave the addition of him in Rogue One. I enjoyed it for what it was.
Yeah, I liked it.
So yeah, it definitely could have been a nice opportunity to spend more time with that character. But I'm enjoying Rampart for the role that he serves.
That's fair.
I hear where you're coming from in terms of wanting more Tarkin. I'm a little indifferent in general in terms of Tarkin, and I want more different characters. Like, one of my complaints in Rebels was that it felt kind of small, because it felt like there was like a small number, and over time it got better in this regard, right? But it felt like it was a small number of Imperial officers on screen, right? And it felt like too much of a coincidence. And so here, if it was just like always Tarkin, I think that would be too much. Like, not that it couldn't have been Tarkin here, but it does feel like I feel like I want more different officers. And just like, speaking to that, like, they do this smuggling mission, right? Or they try and smuggle in some guns, like 36 blasters. Like, this is a planet.
That seems very small, yeah. Like,
I'm like, you didn't just have 36 blasters somewhere lying around. Like, it's like, wow. It's like, that's not really like arms smuggling,
Yeah, I didn't really get what was up with that. And I think that was certainly, I will say, a problem. We brought this up last week in terms of every planet, but especially I think on Ryloth. It does sometimes feel like it's Cham and his merry band of 20 people fighting to liberate a town of 500 instead of like a planet of, like, when you think about how Twi'leks are everywhere in the galaxy, like, Ryloth feels like Ireland, like there's like a huge Twi'lek diaspora community.
Right.
And I want there to be more than 500 people on Ryloth.
Yeah.
I will say I like what you said though about like not wanting the world to feel small. Is actually like even better illustration of why I'm so glad that Hauser is new. Because I think in the same way, like,
totally, it
definitely would have felt, and I think I have no problem with Rampart. I just wish there was like 30 seconds of him like checking in with Tarkin, like,
sure,
some way of having that connection. Because my sense is that by the end of the season, the discussion to discontinue the clones has to be made, and that Tarkin's going to make that decision. And so I definitely want more of him. But what do you guys think of having not having the Bad Batch on screen for most of the episode? Did you miss them, or were you kind of thinking actually it was nice to have a break?
I was so enraptured with what was happening so early on in the episode that I didn't miss them initially. It was around the 8-minute mark. That's when I hovered my cursor over Disney Plus. I was like, wait a second, we're like, how far into this episode are we? 8 minutes in, and it wasn't actually until 13 minutes into the episode that they finally do show up. So I was missing them, but as Paul mentioned earlier, it was an interesting narrative choice to have your title characters basically just cameo in an episode. And it was nice to get that interaction between Hera and Omega. Omega continues to she owned the scene. It was the only offering of the Bad Batch we got that episode, and Tech got a funny line in there, but Omega owned the scene otherwise. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. I really enjoyed that scene on its own, and I feel like maybe they're going to come in to try and rescue Cham or whatever. There might be some further mission going on there, but it definitely felt to me like a narrative choice that I approve of. Like, I like the idea of that.
Right.
I didn't find the episode itself as compelling. I think it's interesting that they're kind of doing the same thing on different planets, sort of like showing how all these transitions are going. The individual stories feel a little bit thin, and each planet feels a little bit like one of those western towns with like one street. You know?
Exactly.
So I would like to feel more depth on a given planet. To Will's comment in the chat, super tangent. Also, hi fellas. I feel like the entirety of Star Wars could have taken place on one large planet instead of an entire galaxy.
Yeah.
That exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's like, and like then you wouldn't have spaceships, so that's why it doesn't.
Right.
But it's I think it's hard to kind of balance like trying to have this big expansiveness with. Like, are you going to have 100 characters on each planet? Like, are you going to show 5 different towns? Like, you could, but then, like, I almost feel like you'd want to do a series for each planet. And, like, I don't know, I could be down for that. Do, I will take the Clone Wars as an example of, at points, being a little less this way.
Yes.
Where because they had multi-episode arcs on given planets at different places, and they would come back to places, it felt a little less that way than most places. But, you still got the ice planet, forest moon, desert planet kind of thing. Where
a lot of like monosphere, only one ecosphere. And Will, who by the way is Will Freeland of the Hype is My Superpower podcast. Great podcast. If you love comics, definitely check it out. He also says that I hate that each planet we go to only ever has one camp or town. Unless the planets are comparable in size to Super Mario Galaxy, then we're good. Which, I get that. I think for sure it could have all been one planet. We needed space battles, which I love the space battles, so I'm not complaining.
Right. Yeah.
One thing I think that the TV show Rebels did quite well is that, especially in the first couple seasons, and even to some extent the last, Rebels is mostly about one planet. Mm-hmm. It's mostly about one planet that is being like hard for the Empire to subjugate, and the ongoing effort there, and then how like the efforts of that planet to push back against the Empire draws the attention of the thing that is forming that becomes the Rebel Alliance, and it gets pulled into other stories. And it's not perfect, but I did think that was a better example of, because they talk about different locations on that planet.
Yeah.
Even Mandalorian, I remember in season 2, there was that one episode where they go to Tatooine, I think, and we learn like there's more than Mos Eisley on Tatooine. And I was like, this is amazing.
Exactly.
It's all desert, but which, one more reason why I'm really excited for the TV show Kenobi, because the Kenobi show book at least gives a much better understanding of that Tatooine is like a not very settled planet with only a couple of like settlements, but also a large indigenous population, the Tusken Raiders. Yeah. So we'll get to that. But yeah, I think I definitely hear what you're saying. I think you're right. Like I like more of the richness of the world, and I think this show would have been better if after like 4 or 5 episodes, like whatever planet Sid is on had become kind of their home planet, and they were mostly doing things around there, or maybe like always coming back there and spending some time there, because it can make the universe feel very small, and like there's only one general anywhere.
Right.
Certainly,
that planet feels like there's like a bar and then an alley.
Yeah.
Right? And like I would like to see a little bit more of that. Like, like a couple episodes or like a few locations on every planet. Right. I think would go a long way.
Yeah, especially because Ryloth, especially, you have had in both some of the books and in some of the Clone Wars, we actually got a much richer picture of Ryloth.
Yeah,
and like how it has there's a lot more to it. The last thing I kind of wanted to bring up, and Paul, maybe I was more into this in part because I was more into the characters. I think one of the reasons I loved it was Hera and Chopper are 2 of my favorite characters from Rebels, maybe 2 of my favorite characters in Star Wars, certainly Chopper. And I just loved getting to see, not their origin story, but like, this felt like, Paul, you and I often talk about the problems with prequels. I felt like this was a good way of showing who Hera was and how she becomes the person we know her to become, without feeling like there was no moment here where I was like, why didn't that ever come up in Rebels? It didn't have the prequel problem, which, granted, it was 10 minutes instead of 2 hours. But how'd you feel about getting to see Hera and Chopper on screen?
It did. So out of all the kind of cameos and characters showing up earlier, it felt a little bit the least organic to me.
Okay.
But, like, I'm not totally sure why, because it feels like it was just like, here's this story,
Right.
Like I don't have a real way I can articulate that and have it make sense, because it feels like it's like, I agree with what you just said. You know, it doesn't have the sort of prequelitis of like, oh well, I mean, like we know like where it's I don't know, like where the story's going. We do know where the story's going. We know, well, some of us do.
Right.
Not all of us do, right? And I guess you don't need to know that. But it just, I don't know. I don't know. Honestly, like it seems fine. Like on paper, it's like, oh yeah, that's good. You know, there wasn't anything really that bothered me about the prequel nature of it, and so that's a success. It just, I don't know. I just like wasn't feeling this episode that much.
Right. That's fair. What about for you, J Scotty, not having seen those characters before? What was kind of your take on them?
Yeah, I'll start with Chopper. In terms of being a droid, I was really impressed with the amount of personality and its unique personality. We've seen a number of droids in the Star Wars universe at this point in time, between L3, C-3PO, R2, obviously. And then, just, I don't know exactly how to describe him. Initially, I was like, is he like a depressed R2? But not quite. He's got a little bit of a gung-ho nature about him too. So I did enjoy his character, and I got a laugh out of him pretty much any time he got kind of animated and started doing his wubs.
Yeah.
I got a kick out of that. For Hera, it was definitely, I got the inklings of like the beginning of the hero's journey, but the moment that really stood out to me was the introduction when she's looking up at the sky and you have those alien birds flying by. The music really stood out, and what I think they were what I'm hoping they were trying to showcase with this character, let me know if I'm right or wrong, but the musical theme there very much sounded like the Binary Sunset meets Leia's theme.
Yeah.
And I was like,
so.
okay, is this supposed to be the best parts of Luke meets the best parts of Leia? Is that this character? I certainly hope so. That sounds like an incredible character.
Yeah, she has she has a very interesting plot arc. I think in part because she doesn't. I don't want to spoil anything for Rebels, but I think she's one of the characters who doesn't feel like she's Luke 2.0 or Han 2.0 or someone like that. Like, she doesn't really fit. She has elements of a couple of those different people in her. And I think first of all, Chopper's great. Yeah, Chopper's just a lot of fun in the Rebels show, and he kind of is breaking a lot of the rules that I think we've established for droids up till now, but it's so much fun that no one really cares. And in some ways, I feel like Chopper is what they would have wanted R2-D2 to be if they had that level of technology for, automated things happening on screen in the 70s.
Sure.
Maybe I'm wrong there. I'm not sure, but that's certainly my impression. I think with Hera especially, maybe part of why I really liked it is, and I mean, Paul, you and I may have disagreed on this, in Rebels, one of my favorite story arcs was Hera and her father. And the kind of the way in which Hera, like the what we learned about their dynamic, I don't even think it was flashbacks, they just talked about it. Like her connection with her father, and her father always kind of being more focused on like saving my people, the people of Ryloth, right, instead of his family necessarily, had really kind of affected her, and how they both came to the rebellion from very different perspectives. And so I just am really liking seeing the beginnings of that dynamic, and it makes me now want to go watch the Rebels episodes where that dynamic comes back.
Yeah, I think if I'd more recently seen Rebels, maybe it would have kind of resonated more for me. That Hera wasn't my favorite character in that they did some things that I think were really cool, and I will say that like I can see some Luke in terms of the sort of like looking off to the stars kind of thing, and I can see some Leia in terms of some other aspects of her character and how she grows, and I can see some Han in terms of flying a ship, and like being like, this is my ship, and so I really do like the character, but in terms of the Rebels show, just like wasn't my favorite. Like Sabine was definitely much more like, she's got to show up in the Mandalorian season 3.
Oh yeah,
like that's all I could say. But like, yeah, it I don't know, it just something
wasn't for everyone.
Yeah, it also could be like it was 3 a.m. and like I just watched a thing where people had accents that I sort of didn't really understand why they had, and then I was like, I don't understand why these people. And now that I do, if I watched it with that context, maybe I would feel a little differently. But like, You know, I don't know.
That's fair. That's totally fair. It's also, I mean, it's episode 11 of an episodic TV show. And I feel like we've kind of like, it's been so long since we've watched episodic TV in some ways,
right.
in these universes, that this feels a little weird. And this feels a little bit less episodic, especially because it's clearly the first part of a 2-part arc.
Right.
It may actually be the entire rest of...
Probably.
What would you say?
Oh, probably, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, do you mind a spoiler
yeah.
based on episode names?
I guess not. Whatever.
Okay. The next episode is like Rescue on Ryloth or something like that.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it may be we're coming up to the end of the season, so maybe I kind of love it if we spend the next 5 episodes on Ryloth. Although I think pretty clearly we have to go back to
Braca,
you know, because that's where
and maybe what's it called?
Maybe meet Cal and, you know, see what but also get back to the planet where they can take more chips out and stuff like that. Although you can certainly do it other places as well. So I think that kind of wraps things up pretty well. Any other last questions from the chat? I know Ash has been having a lot of fun teasing you, Paul. She said, "Oh, Paul, you know why?" And I don't remember what she was saying that in reference to.
That's when I said I don't know why it didn't like kind of resonate with me.
Okay,
in
that's
the
fair.
way, yeah.
Ash, you'd be disappointed. There was no one was
out.
killed. Well, a few people killed, but not any
I think there was
gruesome slaughter.
Yeah. You know.
But yeah, so from you all or from the chat, any other kind of last comments you want to make about the show before we wrap up?
Well, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight a little bit of the animation. So
yeah, please.
I won't harp on the same things I've said in the past. This time around, as far as seeing the Twi'leks go from having only seen them in live action primarily, really impressed with the textures and the markings and like the brandings on the Twi'lek Leku. I kept like finding myself anytime a character was talking, even though there's these incredible micro expressions, microtransaction, shows you where my brain's at with the video game world these days. But yeah, the micro expressions that are happening, especially with the character of Cham, I really felt his conflicted nature was expressed very well across his face. But yeah, going back to the Leku, I just found myself constantly being drawn back and like really intrigued with like the variations between, like, some look like they were intentional body modifications, other one looked like they were more natural birth patterns and what have you. But really good stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think it continues to be a great looking show. There wasn't maybe quite the same level of fight choreography as in some of the others, but that's fine. I'm fine with episodic TV not loving every episode.
Yeah.
They didn't do anything in this episode I hated, and, like, that's a win. Like, like, there wasn't a thing that I was like, oh, this is so... I mean, the thing about, like, they're smuggling 36 guns, it's like, really? That's the, But, like, it didn't, like, set me off, really, on anything. And, like, I'm fine with having a 16-episode season where, like, 8 of the episodes I love.
Yeah.
And, like, 4 of the episodes I like, and, like, 4 of the episodes I'm like, Like, I don't know why, And if they take this arc further, it's possible that I'll get more invested in it and enjoy it more. So,
Yeah, Paul, you and I have often talked about Burn Notice. It's kind of one of our favorite episodic TV shows, and a very good balance of episodic with overall story. And I recently kind of rewatched that with my partner, Mary, and I still think of it as one of the best TV shows I've ever seen. There's definitely some episodes that are kind of weak, they're rocking like 20-some episodes most seasons. Yeah, right? Like there's going to be some kind of fill in the blanks, and that's fine. Right. I kind of that's how I kind of feel about some of the last episodes. But I think this episode has me now much more pumped about the show and kind of concerned because I do think for me a lot of that's because I'm just kind of. I think there are going to be interesting chapters to the story of the Bad Batch, but I feel like they can't really tell those. Like the next step is the finale, and for the Bad Batch themselves. Yeah, not the end of the Bad Batch, but like. No, I get you. I feel like we're kind of in that like holding pattern of we don't want to take the Bad Batch any further because the next big thing is going to be their confrontation with Crosshair and something along those lines. But now we have to have filler for a couple episodes. And like the last couple episodes I thought were great for a lot of things, but I'm not super excited to know what happens to Wrecker or Hunter anymore, which I'm disappointed by. I will say also, I mean, we've gotten so much about Hunter and Wrecker and their interactions with Omega. I would love to see more of Tech and Fives. Like, that might be a fun thing to
Right.
spend some more time on. Because we
Echo.
Yeah.
Fives were sadly.
What?
We're not going to see any more Fives.
Yeah, no, sadly.
I mean, I did reference Fives in this episode,
Right.
but
We can go back and watch them in the Clone Wars again. So, anyway, that was kind of the main stuff I wanted to say. And actually, just say one last thing about Cham Syndulla, because someone actually asked this in the Stranded Panda podcast group. They're saying it feels weird because most of the time when we see him, he's a fighter. And I feel like this actually transition period really makes sense, because my reading of his character arc, there'll be slight spoilers for where he is in Rebels, but I'll try to keep it as slight as possible. You know, during the Clone Wars, he's a rebel and he's a fighter, and he's kind of one of the things that I think makes his character so interesting is he's not out to help the Republic or the Separatists or later the Alliance. He's out to protect Ryloth.
Right.
And I think that's a very interesting perspective of someone who is like, I want to protect my home and I don't care about these larger fights. And it's part of the conflict with him and Hera, and it gets resolved later. But like, so in Clone Wars, he's a rebel. In Rebels, he's the same kind of thing. Here, I kind of like that he's actually being hesitant, because what he feels to me like is someone who has fought for so long, thinks the fight is finally over, and is in that kind of place of like, okay, it's not the best piece, but we're done. It's okay to be done. And is now trying, like, people are starting to remind him, like, maybe we're not done yet, and he's not wanting that. Because I feel like him finally having to accept, okay, nope, we got to go back to the fight, really helps to set up where he is by where we get him in Rebels, when he's just kind of the very sort of, like, weary, cynical, jaded fighter. J Scotty, obviously, I know you haven't seen any of that, but Paul, does that kind of fit? Did his character feel, like, appropriate for in between those two parts of him that we've seen?
Yeah, I feel it works. I feel it fills in the arc some. Speaking of which, I feel like I actually tend to enjoy the filler episodes the most on this and a lot of shows. Like, I just don't need the big plot all the time, you know? And it's like, I feel like this show has had enough episodes that don't connect to the big plot.
Right.
That those episodes don't feel out of place.
Yeah.
The way they might in a series where it's like, if there's 16 episodes and 2 of them don't connect, it feels like, why do you have those 2 episodes?
Yeah.
But like, if 7 or 8 of them don't connect and 7 or 8 of them do, then it feels more balanced. It feels more like, yeah, some big thing isn't going to happen all the time. There's life in between, and we're showing that. But then we're going to show the big things too. But yeah, I do think the character arc makes sense. That's good. Like, it's hard to do, right? To take a character and tell their story here, and then take a character and tell their story here. That's a little easier than some other things, although not the easiest. And then be like, now we're gonna fill in this kind of connective tissue and not doing it in a way that steps on the first one or the last one. And I think they did a good job of that. Yeah. It does feel a little bit of I try to get out, but they keep pulling me back in.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the kind of approach I feel from him. Well, folks, this was great.
Somebody brought up
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, somebody brought up Kenobi earlier when you were talking about exploring a character in between 2 different time periods we've seen. Chloe, is it Chloe Zhao? No, that's in Eternals. Who's doing Kenobi? She did the episodes on Mandalorian.
Deborah Chow?
I think it's Deborah Chow.
Yeah, Deborah Chow. Forgive me. Yeah. Be interested to see how she tackles that one.
Definitely, yeah. The Kenobi and Ahsoka shows are probably 2 of the ones that I'm obviously excited for. Boba Fett and Mandalorian, but especially Kenobi, I think, because I so loved the book. Which is funny because you've all heard my thoughts on the rematch of the century that I have no interest in. But other than that, I'm super excited for Kenobi. Well, folks, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. J Scotty, for people who want to hear your stuff, I know you've just done a great wrap-up of Young Justice. You're doing other stuff on the Animation Liberation podcast. Talk to folks. Where can they hear you?
Animation Deliberation. Wherever you get your podcast, you can find us at Animation Deliberation. If you've got feedback for us, send that to animationdeliberationpodcast@gmail.com. Or if you're a part of the Stranded Panda community and you're part of the Stranded Panda chat, you can always hit up myself or my co-host Zuhair there. I've said it many times, but it's a great time to be a fan of nerdy stuff and animation in particular. We just had the Good, the Bart, and the Loki drop on Disney Plus, which is a crossover between the Marvel Cinematic Universe and The Simpsons. So we're going to do a little cast on that. I'm excited about that. We also have Masters of the Universe, the Revelation series dropping.
I thought that was just a random meme. I had no idea that was an actual thing.
Yeah, it's an actual. So the full run, including credits, is like 6 minutes. So it's a very short thing. But I know Melissa Khalil, who appears on a lot of Panda stuff. She's a huge Simpsons fan, so we're gonna have her on. But I was bringing up Masters of the Universe. The Revelation series is dropping later this month. I know you're a big fan of that, so you've expressed interest in that. Hopefully, we can bring you on for a couple episodes of that. And yeah, it's just a good time. Check us out at Animation Deliberation. Give us some reviews. Give us some love. We're still a new show and looking forward to some growth. So thanks for this opportunity. Always have a pleasure chatting Bad Batch.
Yeah, definitely. And we will have you sing the Animation Deliberation theme song at least once before we get you out of here. Paul, I know you've been kind of jumping around in terms of what you're doing online these days. Where can folks find you?
Zen Madman on Twitch is my main haunt. I'm streaming. I actually streamed just chatting today and talked about things like Clerks and El Mariachi. And speaking of Robert Rodriguez and Boba Fett,
it was a lot of fun.
But yeah, I do a lot of poker, but I'm also doing some other various stuff. You can just come and say hi and hang out and chat a little bit. Also, I've been catching up on Young Justice, and so I can kind of interleave the episodes with the podcast. But in one of the episodes, I was like, they had they have Gotham like in Connecticut, like near New Haven. I looked on a map. I had to pause it, and the app is so bad. But rewinding and trying to fast forward, it's not good. But it's like near New Haven, Connecticut, and I was like, That's not where Gotham is. Like, come on. It is one of the most un-Connecticut cities. I don't know.
Yeah, like, Zack Snyder wants to basically make it like Brooklyn, across the river from Metropolis.
Or
Christopher Nolan wants to make it Chicago. We have some different ideas of what it could be. But anyway, at this point, I think we're far enough afield that it's time to wrap up.
Yeah.
To our listeners, thank you always so much. We'd love to hear your feedback. You can find us on Facebook or Twitter at The Ethical Panda. You can also email us, theethicalpanda@gmail.com. We've been getting a lot of great comments. I'm going to bring some feedback in for later episodes. I might do a Bad Batch feedback episode, depending on how much we get, so please send in more comments. Obviously, we're doing a lot more on Twitch. Hopefully, I'm going to have this up in the next couple of hours, but before Sunday, because Sunday night at 8 o'clock Central, Paul and I will be doing an episode on some animated stuff, actually. Luca and Raya.
Nice. 2
animated movies we're going to talk a lot about. And J Scotty, you and Zuhair are also doing stuff on Raya, so definitely check that out on the Animation Liberation podcast. But if you want to be part of the live recording of our episode for Superhero Ethics, check that out at 8 p.m. Central, right here on twitch.tv, The Ethical Panda. Please drop us a follow. Drop a follow to Zen Madman's channel. You're probably already listening, but if not, definitely drop a follow to the Stranded Panda TV channel. They do Twitch. They're doing now a Thursday night show with Jeff and Ashley, where they get drunk and talk about mythology. That's a lot of fun. There's all sorts of great stuff going on. And, of course, all the podcasts that I'm part of, as well as the ones that J Scotty is a part of, and all the rest of this, you can find all that at the Stranded Panda Podcast Network. You can go to strandedpanda.com or just search for Stranded Panda Chat on Facebook. You'll find a great community where we have been very good about having a community that has great discussion, great feedback, a lot of back and forth. Some of it's fun memes, some of it's deep discussion. But we don't have any toxicity that we allow, and we don't allow spoilers in the first 48 hours for anything. So if you hear this now, you want to jump on a fan site and not get spoiled about Bad Batch, not get spoiled about Black Widow, or don't have any spoilers about Bad Batch, you'll nest it all, you'll see it there. But yeah, it's a great place to jump on in. So Stranded Panda Chat on Facebook, Ethical Panda, The Ethical Panda, and Zen Madman. Check out both of those on twitch.tv. And most importantly, the one thing I'll ask you to do, the most important thing that I'm please asking you to do from the very bottom of my heart, have a good day.
If you want it.